Great introduction. Now to try and live up to it. Some books come up and mug their authors from behind, and Badland was one of those. I was working quietly and rather unproductively in the spring of 1994 on a project long dear to my heart, which was to write a book about the sea, which people who thought they hated the sea might still be able to read, and slowly accumulating a few pages. Mostly I was doing what professional writers spend most of their time doing, which is inserting pages into the typewriter, filling the page with words, pulling it out and sending a rejection slip to it and posting it into the waste paper basket. When at 11 o'clock one morning, my telephone rang beside the typewriter, and it was my friend Mike Wollaston, who keeps a little marina down on the ship canal where I stable my boat, just down at the bottom of the road where I live in Seattle. And he said, "What you doing for lunch? I'm paying." Now this phrase, "I'm paying," was entirely uncharacteristic of him. And when I went down to the bar of Ponte's restaurant down by Fremont Bridge on the ship canal in Seattle to meet him, I went with a certain reservation in my mind and a memory of the fact that Mike had said, "I'm paying." Why? I instantly saw why when I entered the bar. And there he was, sitting at the bar with a pile of incredibly dog-eared typescript sitting in front of him, which he instantly shuffled to one side as I arrived and said, "What are you going to drink?" We managed to go through lunch with me eyeing the typescript, which by this stage had disappeared to the side of where he was sitting, and I kept on sort of peering over the table all the way through lunch, thinking, "Oh God, he's written a novel. He wants me to read it. It's going to be called Murder at the Marina," or something like this. And it wasn't until coffee stage that finally he sort of coughed and made these embarrassed gestures and said, "I've got a manuscript." My heart sank even further. But it turned out that it wasn't a manuscript, thank God, that he'd been writing. It was a manuscript written by his father, Percy Wollaston, in 1972, when Percy himself was 71. And it described growing up on a homestead in eastern Montana. And I took this pile of pages back home with me to read. And Mike had said, "You know, my dad gave it to me. He said, I don't know whether it was worth doing, but, you know, it's probably not worth reading, but this is what I've done anyway, and you're probably not interested, but you might take a read of it." The question was, did I think that it might find a publisher? So I took it home that afternoon and read it, and was totally transported by it into a part of the United States that was wholly unfamiliar to me, and a moment in its history that I knew nothing about. The getting of a homestead in 1910 on this dry bit of prairie in eastern Montana. Well, we did find a publisher for it eventually. It came out this month. It's in stock at all good bookstores. It's called Homesteading by Percy Wollaston. It's got a fine cover. I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from that. You have to remember, you have to think of it not as a nicely printed book like this, published by the Lions Press, price $20. You have to think of it not like that, but as this pile of incredibly dog-eared sheets of paper, typed by a man 20-something years before, a man who'd grown up on the prairie and had one of the great things that people learned growing up on the prairie, I think, was the habit of frugality. And there was nothing that Percy Wollaston was more frugal with than typewriter ribbons. He worked on an ancient manual Olivetti with jumpy letters so that sort of E's would kind of come up, you know, a whole full space. So you'd see this line of ease prancing across the page, sort of slightly above the words they were all supposed to belong to. And equally, the typewriter ribbon would be worn to the point where he would only change one when he pressed down on a key, the letters actually became invisible on the page. So that one had to pore one's way through this manuscript. I mean, it was like decoding some ancient sacred text in a language not quite English. But it was wonderfully written, if one could sort of put up with the slightly odd mechanical features of its reproduction. Let me just give you a couple of paragraphs from that book. To give you just a flavour of my excitement on that sort of spring afternoon in 1994, feeling myself just, you know, this is a world I know nothing about. Spring finally came with its first meadowlarks and its crocus blooms, its sound of the running creek. The ground became soft enough for post holes to be dug and the fencing started. Then the day when the plough was gotten out and Dad started the first furrow. That was a ceremony in itself, to see the first of the long strips of sod turn like a wave away from the blade of the plough. Just under the grass, there was a black layer of fine, rich soil from 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch thick. I realize now that this was the accumulation of centuries of fertilization and the only really good soil there was. It's beautifully written. It transports you to all the details of living on a homestead on the prairie. And there was nothing I could do, having read the manuscript, except, you know, drive 1,000 miles east and find the site of the homestead. And from then on, I just got sort of mugged by this other book, which I wanted to write. And let me now, if I may, read you the first chapter of Badland, which is a kind of invocation to that land, that landscape. It's called The Open Door, which is both the open door of a haunted house, which comes into the narrative, and it's also meant to summon to people familiar with the grand phrases of American political rhetoric, that other open door, the idea of America as having its door open to immigrants, and that open door policy which prevailed, inviting immigrants much as the poem by Emma Lazarus from the base of the Statue of Liberty invited them to come to these shores. Breasting the regular swells of land on a red dirt road as true as a line of longitude, the car was like a boat at sea. The ocean was hardly more solitary than this empty country, where in 40 miles or so I hadn't seen another vehicle. A warm westerly blew over the prairie, making waves, and when I wound down the window, I heard it growl in the dry grass like surf. For gulls, there were killdeer plover, crying out their name as they wheeled and skidded on the wind. Killdeer, killdeer. The surface of the land was as busy as a rough sea. It broke in sandstone outcrops, low buttes, ragged bluffs, hollow combers of bleached clay, and was fissured with waterless creek beds, ash-white, littered with boulders. Brown cows nibbled at their shadows on the open range. In the bottomlands, where muddy rivers trickled through the cottonwoods, were fenced rectangles of irrigated green. Corn, wheat, alfalfa. Though I grew up in farmland, asthma and hay fever kept me at an allergic distance from crops and animals, and it was with the uninformed pleasure of the urban tourist that I watched this countryside unfold. I loved its dry, hillocky emptiness. Here was space and distance on a scale unimaginable to most city dwellers. Here one might loaf and stretch and feel oneself expand to meet the enormous expanse of the surrounding land. I stopped the car on the crest of a big swell and attacked a shrink-wrapped sandwich bought at a gas station several hours before. The smell of red dust, roasted, biscuity, mixed with the medicinal smell of the sagebrush that grew on the stony slopes of the buttes. I thought I could spend all day just listening here, to the birds, the crooning wind, the urgent fiddling of the crickets. The road ahead tapered to infinity in stages. Hill led to hill led to hill, and at each summit the road abruptly shrank to half its width, then half its width again, until it became a hairline crack in the land, then a faint wobble in the haze, then nothing. From out of the nothing now came a speck. It disappeared. It resurfaced as a smudge, then as a fist-sized cloud. A while passed. Finally, on the nearest of the hilltops, a full-scale dust storm burst into view. The storm enveloped a low-slung pickup truck, which slowed and came to a standstill beside the car, open window to open window. Run out of gas? No, I waved the remains of the hideous sandwich. Just having lunch. The driver wore a Stetson, once white, which in age had taken on the color and some of the texture of a ripe gorgonzola cheese. Behind his head, a big caliber rifle was parked in a gun rack. I asked the man if he was out hunting, for earlier in the morning I'd seen herds of pronghorn antelope. They'd bounded away from the car on spindly legs, the white signal flashes on their rumps telegraphing danger to the rest. But no, he was on his way into town to the store. Round here, men wore guns as part of their everyday uniform, packing Winchesters to match their broad-brimmed hats and high-heeled boots. While the women I'd seen were dressed for the 1990s, nearly all the men appeared to have stepped off the set of a period western. Mr. Big Snake back there by the creek. He didn't look at me as he spoke, but stared fixedly ahead with the wrinkled, long-distance gaze that solo yachtsmen forever searching for a landfall eventually acquire. He was a beauty. Put him at 6 feet or better. Could have used the rattle off of that fella. With a blunt-fingered hand the size of a dinner plate, he raked through the usual flotsam of business cards, receipts, spent ballpoints, and candy wrappings that had collected in the fold between the windshield and the dash. Some of my road kills, he said. Half a dozen snake rattles like whelk shells lay bunched in his palm. Looks like you have a nice hobby there. It beats getting bit. He seemed in no particular hurry to be on his way, and so I told him where I came from, and he told me where he came from. His folks had homesteaded about 8 miles over in that direction, and he wagged his hat brim southwards across a treeless vista of withered grass, pink shale, and tufty sage. They'd lost their place back in the dirty 30s. Now he was on his wife's folks' old place, 12 miles up the road, had 11 sections up there. A section is a square mile. That's quite a chunk of Montana. What do you farm? Mostly cattle. We grow hay and 1.5 sections as wheat some years when we get the moisture for it. And it pays. One year we make quite a profit. Next year we go twice as deep as that in the hole. That's about the way it goes round here. We sat on for several minutes in an amiable silence, punctuated by the cries of the killdeer and the faulty muffler of the pickup. Then the man said, "Nice visiting with you," and eased forward. In the rear-view mirror, I watched his storm of dust subside behind the brow of a hill. In the 19th century, when ships under sail crossed paths in mid-ocean, they spoke each other with signal flags. Then, if sea conditions were right, they hove to lowered boats, and the 2 captains, each seated in his gig, would have a gam, exchanging news as they bobbed on the wave-tops. In Moby Dick, Melville devoted a chapter to the custom, which was still alive and well on this ocean-like stretch of land. It was so empty that 2 strangers could feel they had a common bond simply because they were encircled by the same horizon. It hadn't always been so empty here. The few working ranches were now separated from their neighbors by miles and miles of rough, ribbed, ungoverned country, and each ranch made as self-important a showing on the landscape as a battlemented castle. First, there was the elaborately painted mailbox representing a plough, a wagon team, a tractor, a well-hung Hereford bull, set at the entrance to a gravel drive. A little way beyond it stood a gallows with 25-foot posts supporting an arched crosspiece emblazoned with the names of 2 or 3 generations of family members, along with the heraldic devices of the family cattle brands. Numbers and letters, rampant and couchant, in Western talk, upright and lazy. In the far distance lay the ranch, its houses, barns and outbuildings screened by a shelter belt of trees. Trees. Here, where almost no trees grew of their own accord except along the river bottoms, these domestic forests announced that their owners had water, agricultural know-how, and long occupancy of the land. You could arrive at an accurate estimate of a given family's income, character, and standing in Montana just by looking at their shelter belt. Some were no more than a threadbare hedge of sickly cottonwoods, but 1 or 2 were as tall and dense and green as a bluebell wood in spring. The families were so few, their farms so unexpected and commanding, that they mapped the land, stamping it with their names, much as England used to be mapped by its cathedral cities. Here, where a crew of surly heifers blocked the road beside the creek, was Garber country. A barred lazy A and upright T were burned into the hide of each animal. The family brand of the Garbers, Jean, Fernand, Warren, Bernie, whose grand ranch entrance I'd passed 8 or 9 miles back. I honked and was met by a unanimous stare of sorrowing resentment, as if I were trying to barge my way through an important cow funeral. A mile on, more cattle. Bullocks this time, scarred with the same bar lazy AT. New names fell at long, slow intervals. Brown, Breen, Shoemaker, Householder. Their estates were great, but bare and comfortless. It might be nice enough in June to look out from your window and know yourself to be the owner of all the dust, rock, and parched grass you could see and more. But how would it be in January at minus 25 degrees? Then the sheer breadth and weight of the land would get you. I thought I'd rather settle for a more sociable berth, like being a lighthouse keeper. For every surviving ranch, I passed a dozen ruined houses. The prairie was dotted about with wrecks. Their windows, empty of glass, were full of sky. Strips of ice blue showed between their rafters. Some had lost their footing and tumbled into their cellars. All were buckled by the drifting tonnage of Montana's winter snows. Their joists and roof beams warped into violin curves. Skewed and splayed, the derelicts made up a distinctive local architecture. It took me a while to see the little hilltop graveyards. I'd mistaken them for cattle pens. Fenced with barbed wire and juniper posts, each held 10 or 12 rotting wooden crosses, with, here and there, a professionally chiseled undertaker's headstone. Save for the odd empty jam jar, the individual graves were untended, but someone kept the fences up and the grass neatly cut. I supposed that for farmers here it came with the territory, the job of looking after the dead strangers on your land. Once the eye grew accustomed to the dizzying sweep and chop of the prairie and began to focus on its details, the whole country presented itself as a graveyard. It was so strewn with the relics of the dead. Single fence posts trailing a few whiskers of wire. The body of a Studebaker vintage circa 1940 stripped of its wheels and engine on a sandy knoll. A harrow deep in the grass, its tines rusting to air. On the tops of the buttes, small cairns of carefully piled stones. For as far as one could see, the dead had left their stuff lying around to dissolve back into nature in its own time at its own place. A civilization of sorts, its houses, cars, machinery, was fading rapidly off the land, and it wouldn't be long now before its imprint was as faint as that of the Plains Indians' teepee rings or the shallow grooves worn by the single-file herds of buffalo. I pulled up beside a wrecked house that stood close to the road and, stepping high and cautiously for fear of 6-foot rattlers, made my way through the remains of the garden, past the assorted auto parts, the stoved-in chicken coop, the tin bath with a hole in its bottom, the wringer, the bedstead, the Frigidaire with the missing door. Though its frame had started to corkscrew and its front wall bulged, the house was in better shape than most, a gabled, 2-story cottage with a collapsed veranda that in its day must have been as proudly, prettily suburban as any farmhouse on the prairie. Inside, I was met by a panic scurry of wings. Swallows had built their wattle and daub nests at picture height on the parlour walls. Squealing shrilly, the birds fled through the windows. It looked as if the owners had left the place as precipitately as the swallows. They'd left most of their furniture as it stood, to the mice who'd nested in the sofa cushions, and the birds who'd marbled the slip covers with their droppings. A fly swatter hung on its appointed nail. A fold-away ironing board stood open, inviting the thought that perhaps the family had left the house for the last time in their Sunday best. In the room beyond, the walk-in closet was still full of clothes on wooden hangers. I reached for a dress, but the mildewed cotton came away in my hand like a fistful of spiderweb. In the bottom of the closet stood a pair of cowboy boots. All day I'd felt in urgent need of snake boots, but these were a good size and a half on the large side for me, and their leather was so stiff and cracked that it felt fossilized. Above each window in the house, the curtain rods had torn fringes of lace suspended from them. These genteel remnants shivered in the wind. Lace curtains on the prairie. Whoever had put them up had made a thorough job of her hem-stitching. Though the curtains themselves had rotted and blown out long ago, their stubs looked as if they might yet survive several more years of gales and blizzards. I could feel the woman's excitement in her handiwork as she veiled the buttes and outcrops with a pretty fall of white lace. The curtains must have altered the land for her as importantly as any amount of ploughing and planting. The parlour floor was a musty rubble of papers, books, magazines. Here, open on its title page, was a copy of Campbell's Soil Culture Manual, badly foxed and swollen with damp. There was an ancient Montgomery Ward mail-order catalogue. I stirred the rubble with my shoe and raised a mud-splattered postcard, mostly illegible. Dear Neva, hi, honey. What's the splosh? With you? Did you? Splosh. Or are you? Splosh. We went fishing. Splosh. If you have to go down to meet her, splosh. We went to the dance Monday. Splosh. Couldn't darn. Splosh. Saturday? Splosh. In the corner behind the sofa lay a sheaf of manuscript pages. They'd been chucked into the single dry spot in the room, which had otherwise been raked from end to end by rain and snow, and the ink on them was unsmudged. Perched on the sofa arm, I settled down to read. The densely scribbled figures looked like prose, but were in fact an epic of desperate, small hours arithmetic. A sum that continued over 7 pages of heavily corrected addition and multiplication. The handwriting grew crankier, more bunched and downward sloping as the sum progressed and the numbers mounted. To begin with, it didn't look so bad. The amounts were small, $4.20, $9.15, $2.54, and they took time to swell up and burst. They sketched a careful life, rent to the Bureau of Land Management. The letters BLM were repeated several times and ringed in a blue doodle that went through the surface of the paper. Payments to Sears, to Coast Hardware, to Kyle's Radiator Shop, to Lawler Drug for animal vaccines, to J.T. Rugg for seeds, to Walter Somebody for tractor tires, to L. Price for a whole bunch of things, to Farmer's Elevator, to Sinclair Blacksmith, to Oscar Overland for oats, to Ward's and Heppel's and Gamble's and Fullerton Lumber. On page 3, a ringed figure showed for the first time. $1,040.40. Note at Baker Bank. The The interest on this loan looked enviably low. At $40.50 for the year, it came out at around 4.25%. But even this was more than the family was spending on clothes, $35.51 with everything bought at J.C. Penney. $1,040.40. The horrible amount of the note was written out several times over in the margins and islanded with shaky circles. By the last page, the handwriting was all over the place and the figures were standing or leaning an inch high on the paper. How do you turn $2.54 into $5,688.90? I've made my own pages of calculations in the same distraught writing, seen the numbers gang up on me and breed, and what the bottom line always says is the old 2 a.m. cry, we can't go on living like this. This house had been built to last. Its frames were stout, its cedar floor laid like a yacht's deck. It had been meant for the grandchildren and their children's children, and it must have seemed in, 1915, 1920, a rock-solid investment, a fine house in the country with a barn and outbuildings. Even now, one could feel the pride of its owners in their creation, though it had sunk in value to a few dollars worth of firewood and a convenient nesting box for the neighborhood birds. An emigrant myself, trying to find my own place in the landscape and history of the West, I took the ruins personally. From the names in the graveyards, I thought I knew the people who'd come out here, Europeans, mostly of my grandparents' generation, for whom belief in America and its miraculous power of individual redemption was the last great European religion. Faith in a bright future was written into the carpentry of every house. To lay such a floor as that, tongue in chiseled groove, was the work of a true believer. Looking now at the fleet of lonely derelicts on the prairie awash in grass and sinking fast, I could guess at how that faith had been shaken. Immigrant, noun, says Ambrose Bierce's The Devil's Dictionary. An unenlightened person who thinks one country better than another. I knew about that. Aged 47, I'd chucked up everything and just cleared off. It wasn't a long or well-considered move. On a visit to the Pacific Northwest, I caught a shadowy glimpse of a new life and flung myself at it. Arrived in Seattle, I worked hard to make the new life stick, but I was short of roots and reasons. I took to making long drives eastwards, which in the West means backwards in time, always looking out for some point of connection between my own careless flight west and that of my precursors. Lacking an American past of my own, I hoped to find someone else's cast-off history that would fit my case. Here, among the ruins, 1,000 miles and 80 years east of Seattle, was the point I had been searching for. I was certain of it. A little further on, past another pocket cemetery, stood a schoolhouse on a hill. Hay bales were stacked in what had been the yard between the trestle frame of the swings and the basketball hoop on its pole. Some flakes of whitewash still adhered to the bare grain of the wood on the schoolhouse wall. I stepped inside. A dead woodpecker lay on the floor, and more swallows had built their mud igloos on the walls. But the schoolroom retained the odor of morning milk, wet coats, and spelling bees. The place had been heated by a great cast-iron stove, dusty and bird-limed now. In winter, it would have roared and crackled through the lessons, its voice as memorable to the students as that of the teacher. A framed sepia engraving of George Washington hung over the blackboard, on which some recent visitor had left the chalked message, "Spokane or bust." The teachers' quarters were downstairs in the basement. Ice heaves had wrecked the cement floor, but everything else was in place. The chaste single bed, the table and upright chair, the propane gas cooker, the rocker with a maroon velvet cushion for listening to the radio in the evenings over a mug of cocoa and a book. The chest of drawers had been emptied, but there were 3 cardboard boxes of mouldering schoolbooks under the bed. Comfortably seated in her rocking chair, I leafed through the teacher's library. The books had been published between 1910 and the late 1930s. Grade school readers, most of them put out by Ginn and Company, enshrining a version of America that now seemed hardly less distant than that of the Pilgrim Fathers. It was so bold and bright and innocent. Have you a flag hanging in your schoolroom? What are the colors in our flag? Many people think that these colors have a meaning. They think that the red in our flag means that we must be brave. They think that the blue in our flag means that we must be true. They think that the white means that we must be clean. A poem printed in Gothic script nicely caught the mood of things. A youth across the sea, for the sake of a hope in his breast, shook out a steadfast sail upon a dauntless quest. He'd seen a star in the west. He had dreamed a dream afar. He wrought and would not rest. Heirs of that dream we stand, citizens of that star, America, dear land. I read stories about Washington and Betsy Ross, about the sickly boyhood of Theodore Roosevelt. For years he had to sleep sitting up against some pillows. He could not lie down without coughing. And the impoverished boyhood of Andrew Jackson. But Andrew kept growing in spite of all they said. He clenched his little fists at colic, measles, and whooping cough. He talked very early and walked instead of crawled. From a useful book titled Who Travels There, I learned what to do when lost in the wilderness. If you ever find that you are lost, do not become frightened. There is more danger in fright than there is in starvation or accident. If you allow yourself to become frightened, you become possessed of what we call the panic of the lost. As soon as you discover that you have lost your way in the wilderness, sit down with your back against a stump or stone, take out your jackknife, and play mumblety-peg or sing a song. This will pull you together, so to speak. Then take a stick, smooth off a place in the dirt, and try to map out your wanderings. Making this map will cause you to remember forgotten objects you've passed on the road and may help you to retrace your steps. The America of the school books was a realm of lonely but invigorating adventure where poor farm boys grew up to be president, land of the brave, the true, and the clean, where a beckoning star stood permanently above the western horizon, and poverty and ill health were mere tests of one's American mettle. To prairie children, this schoolbook America must have seemed reasonably close to home. Its heroes were small farmers like their parents. There were no cities in it, and not a whiff from the smokestacks of heavy industry. Theodore Roosevelt's childhood, most of which had actually been spent on East 20th Street in Manhattan, was relocated for storybook purposes to the great outdoors, where little Theodore tried to take part in all the sports which other children took part in. He tried so hard that before he was a big boy, he could swim and row and skate and box and shoot. He could ride horseback. He could sail a boat. Beyond the village and the farm lay the wilderness, from which boys with jackknives learned to navigate their way home. The values honored in the books, self-reliance, piety, woodcraft, patriotism, were all values that would come in handy in eastern Montana. Children in New York and Chicago poring over the same texts might as well have been reading about life in Uttar Pradesh. Here, though, you could see your own experience intimately reflected in the books. The Grade 3 Learn to Study Reader 1924 had a chapter titled How to Save. Have you ever tried to help your father and mother to save money? Some children think that they cannot save because they are not working and earning money. You can save money by saving other things. Good advice followed. Save your clothes. Keep out of the mud. Hang your things up when you take them off. Use a napkin when you're eating. Learn to sew on buttons. Mark your possessions. Keep your rubbers fastened together with a clothespin. Buy a 10-cent roll of adhesive tape and use it to put your name on your cap, gloves, and boots. Shave a strip off the top of your pencil and write your name there. Don't waste costly paper. If you want to draw a picture, do it on the back of a used sheet. The chapter on buying Christmas presents gave one an idea of the kinds of luxuries that were within dreaming distance of a third grader on the prairie. A spinning top, 10 cents. A jackknife, 38 cents. A striped ball, 5 cents. A toy automobile, 65 cents. A locomotive, $1. And hope against hope, way up on top of the list, a pair of skates for $2. The 12 designated presents came to a total of $5.68. I loaded 2 armfuls of books into the boot of the car and headed south to Baker, where I put up in a motel room furnished with junk from the wilder reaches of the 1950s. The pictures on its walls were all of water. 2 horseback explorers were in the act of discovering a mountain lake. A pack-horse bridge spanned a river in what looked like Constable country. Printed on dark blue velvet, a Japanese sea was in the grip of a tsunami. They were pictures for a dry country. At $23.50 for 3 beds, a bathroom, and a fully equipped kitchen, the room was pleasingly in character with the frugal spirit of the place. That evening, a lightning storm moved in on Baker from the west. One could see it coming for an hour before it hit, the distant artillery flashes on a sky of deep episcopal purple. As the storm advanced, I sat in a bar on Main Street, reading the life of Patrick Henry in 4 American Patriots, a book for young Americans by Alma Holman Burton. Colonel Washington, said Mr. Davis, is only 23 years old. I cannot but hope that Providence has preserved the youth in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. Ah, thought Patrick, George Washington has done so much for his country, and he is only 23. The people in the bar were huddled and talkative. Living by day in so much space and solitude, they evidently liked to squash up close at night. At the back of the place, 2 poker tables were in session, with the players gossiping unprofessionally between reckless bids of 50 cents a time. He looked down at his hands. They were brown and rough with toil. Alas, he said, I do my best, and yet I cannot even make a living on my little farm. This was quite true. Patrick could not make his crops grow. Then his house caught fire and burned to the ground. It was all very discouraging. The snippets of bar conversation were on the whole more interesting than Alma Holman Burton's prose. A Mexican seated at the table next to me was talking to a scrawny, pencil-moustached 30-ish type perched on a swivel stool at the bar. The Mexican said he was up in Baker from Wilmer, Texas. Wilmer? Said the guy at the bar in a whoop of delighted recognition. I know Wilmer. I was in jail in Wilmer. Buy a drink, man. And so, at the age of 23, Patrick Henry, with a wife and little children to provide for, did not have a shilling in his pocket. But his father helped a little, and Sarah's father helped a little, and they managed to keep the wolf from the door, which would not have been a dead metaphor to a child in eastern Montana, where wolves picked off the sheep at nights and wolfers trapped the animals for bounty. The thunder was directly overhead, and it was immediately followed by a long kettle-drummed 2 of rain on the roof. The bar went quiet. Everyone in it listened to the rain. It's a gully washer, the bartender said, gathering in the empties. The thunder rolled away eastwards towards North Dakota. but the rain kept coming. "It's a gully washer," said the man who'd done jail time in Wilmer as if he'd just minted the expression. A crowd formed at the open doorway of the bar to watch the downpour. The rain fell in gleaming rods. Main Street was a tumbling river, already out of its banks and spilling over onto the sidewalk. Its greasy waters were coloured red, white and blue by the neon signs in the bar window. A truck sloshed past at crawling speed, throwing up a wake that broke against the doors of darkened stores. "That," said a turnip-faced old brute in a Stetson, speaking in the voice of long and hard experience, "is a gully washer." People craned to see. A couple had brought their toddler along. This was an easy-going bar in an easy-going town. The man lifted her onto his shoulders to give her a grandstand view of the wonder. The rain made everyone young. People dropped their guard in its presence, and the pleasure in their faces was as empty of self-consciousness as that of the toddler, who bounced against her father's neck, saying, "Water, water, water." Some shook their heads slowly from side to side, their faces possessed by the same aimless smile. Some whistled softly through their teeth. A woman laughed, a low, cigarette-stoked laugh that sounded uncannily like the hiss and crackle of the rain itself. It went on raining. It was still raining when I drove back to the motel, where the forecourt was awash and the kitchen carpet blackly sodden. I sat up listening to it, attuned now to what I ought to hear. When rain falls in these parts, in what used to be known as the Great American Desert, it falls with the weight of an astounding gift. It falls like money. Thank you. Questions, memoirs, comments? Yes?
How did someone from Britain fall in love with the interior of the United States? I read your book about the Mississippi, and now you have this about the part of the plains. Was there something in your background that fascinated you about this part of the world?
Well, I've always been a sort of creature of America from afar. I think it started, almost my sort of first proper memories when I was 3. I was born in 1942, and 3 miles up the road in one direction was a prisoner of war camp, German prisoner of war camp. And 3 miles down the road in the other direction, there was an American military base. And I imagine it must have been VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. I remember this line of American armored cars coming down the village street where we lived. And the Americans, who looked sort of 3 times life-size, I mean, big, milk-fed people. I mean, the English were these kind of stick and string people kind of living on rations, and the Americans who'd been feeding at their PX all the way through the war, kind of were giants in our world. And they were sitting in open armoured cars, throwing sticks of gum from the PX out to the kids. And I came from a sort of genteel family. The village kids were all scrambling in the dirt, racing for the gum. And I badly wanted to be doing exactly the same thing, but my mother held me back. You know, we were above that kind of thing. No child of mine goes out onto the road, and it was one of my great disappointments that I wasn't able to scrabble for gum. And then after that came, that avalanche of American music, Bill Haley, and American movies, of course, and then for me, American novels. So that actually, although I supposedly lectured in English as my first proper job, I was actually lecturing in American literature, and my PhD thesis, which was predictably never finished, was on American literature. It had a fine title. No, I can't even recall it, and I won't tell it to you now. It would embarrass me too much. But that sort of interest in America and American culture was here long, long before I first actually visited this country. And certainly one of the most sort of powerful novels I can remember ever reading as a child was Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which I think I read at 7 going on 8. And I can't actually have understood much of it, but I was completely transfixed by the image of that river as the raft moved down it. And no, it hasn't been hard, really, to make the move over to this country. But what was interesting for me in finding the landscape of eastern Montana was finding this sort of point of connection with an alternative history that almost might have been my own family history. Let me just tell you that I'll stop being so verbose on this answer in a moment, but the Percy Wollaston book, to which my own book is much indebted, because I mean it's really his family history that I borrow. I knew right from the beginning that there were kind of quite powerful parallels between the Wollaston family and my own family. Both entail long, long lines of clergymen of the Church of England going back into the sort of 17th century at least. What I didn't know was something I discovered only after I'd finished the book, that when I went to visit my father last year when he was dying, I saw on his shelves a facsimile copy of the parish registers of Penn in Staffordshire, from where I knew that both the Wollastons and the Rabans first showed up. It's in our family history, both begins in Penn in Staffordshire, a tiny hamlet, I mean, this big, in county on the sort of border of England and Wales. And I opened the first page, and it was 1548, and there were two church wardens at the time. One was a Wollaston and one was a Raban. So I feel our family histories are extraordinarily, sort of eerily intertwined. And I think, I always think that what I was writing was the sort of history of what would have happened if my own family had come over initially to Minnesota, as the Wollastons did in around 1880, and then had tried to set up an American life. And working out in some way the sort of relationship I have with this guy who owns the boatyard where I keep my boat. You know, would I have turned into Mike Wollaston? That would have been interesting. Yes?
I noticed you used a lot of sea imagery in that. I was wondering if you ever wrote your book about the sea. Does this satisfy you somehow?
No, but it's a sort of shipwreck story. It's a shipwreck story set on the land. I mean, the chapter titles are even worse. I mean, the titles like Plain Sailing, Heavy Weather, Clinging to the Wreckage. Sort of heavy illusion, I'm afraid. But it keeps on trying to sort of remind the reader that this is really a sea story that happens to be set on land, where people go on a long voyage and the whole fleet gets wrecked. But yes, I'm now returned. I'm sort of partway through, slightly less than half, a book about the sea. They're not mercifully quite the same book about the sea that I was trying to write in 1994, but a different one that takes up from where that left off.
Do you find Americans endlessly amusing?
Endlessly amusing? How do you mean?
Well,
that suggests the kind of condescension that I absolutely do not feel.
I get a great sense of amusement when I read Old Glory and some of your other books that you come and you find these characters and these peculiar circumstances, and as a visitor in some respects, or at least particularly when you wrote Old Glory, I mean, you were able to step back and say, isn't that peculiar?
Yeah, I think that's something that's going on less. I mean, I think inevitably, one changes as one's circumstance changes. No, Gloria, you're absolutely right. For this book, written from the perspective of London, about traveling down the river in a small boat from Minneapolis to the Gulf of Mexico, and it was, seen from a distance of 5,000 miles. And I think there's a sort of 5,000-mile narrative distance between the position of the writer of the book and the experience described in the book. This book was very much written from the perspective of an immigrant himself, trying to put himself in, or put his feet in the shoes of a much earlier generation of immigrants and look out through their eyes. So that distance, I think, has narrowed to about that. And I live inside the American language now. I mean, it's the language I wake to and go to sleep to. And,
do you feel a sense of loss, though? I mean,
no.
You did have that sort of unique perspective. But being closer is what, better? More useful, more interesting?
I don't know. I mean, I think any perspective sort of properly embodied in words and fully written is bound to be unique. I mean, there's almost nothing unique about unique perspectives. I mean, if only you can get your own point of view right, then it remains unique. And it seems to me, you know, my point of view has changed, but I don't feel that it is less singular a point of view. No, in fact, it's just become singular in a different kind of way. I hope. Yeah.
Your book about the sea, is it going to involve you shipping out on a sea voyage to various places?
Yes, but that's a sort of thin strand in it. Yeah, I sailed a boat from Seattle to Juneau, Alaska, and back last year, and that's going to provide a sort of narrative thread. But the book is actually it's the 18th century sea, the Indian Sea, the sea of the fur traders and the missionaries and the contemporary tugboat captains and fishermen and my own sea. But it's like a rope, you know, lots of different strands around a sort of central core, and the core somewhere in the middle is my own trip in my sailboat, Seattle to Juneau, Alaska. Yes?
How was your experience trying to fit in with the small-town Montana residents? I mean, did you find that you were out of place?
Yes, but in a way that I could not quite have predicted. Everybody was not interested. Everybody was interested not in my strange accent, or you're from England, but you're from Seattle. And this, I did run into, I suppose predictably, that sense of deep suspicion and sometimes hostility of the countryside against the city. And it was as a person from the city that I felt most uneasy, not as an Englishman. I mean, they weren't interested. People on the whole were not interested in my being an Englishman. But they knew that I came from a city. I mean, they only had to look at my silly Jeep Cherokee to know that I came from a city. And, you know, I wore the kind of clothes that, you know, were all wrong for Eastern Montana. And it was interesting, that, because I felt that we were living out some kind of dialogue between the city and the countryside, and how very, very far apart those two worlds are in contemporary American life, don't you think? Yes.
How cognizant were you of all of this kind of Great Plains literature that has been coming out over the last decade? It seems to me that there's many more books out there and it's just beginning. Prairie Earth, Grassland by Fraser, and Dakota. And were you familiar with those books?
I'd read Ian Fraser's The Great Plains. I deliberately avoided reading Prairie Earth, because it also centered on a small patch of ground, and I sort of knew that it was there, and I rather anxiously asked various people who'd read it to tell me whether there was anything in it that I felt ought to threaten my project or make me read it before I went any further, and was on the whole assured that there wasn't. But I was sort of nervously aware of that book. But of course, I mean, there is a great, there's a long literature centered around this. I mean, Rilvag's Giants in the Earth, My Antonia. I mean, you know, one could assemble a long literary reading list. And yet, however many books have been added about this experience on the prairie, it still does seem, as you were saying, to be a kind of hole in the American memory. I mean, people will remember the individual books, but they somehow won't, I don't know why, remember the whole experience. It doesn't seem to have the importance in the general public memory that it might have. Any other questions? Thank you very much indeed.